Okay, I think we'll dive right in here today. Lecture 11. My plan is to talk a little bit about competitive markets some more, and in particular, I guess what you could call market dynamics. Right? This is kind of understanding the behavior of a market, a competitive market, anyways, over time. So just the administrative stuff here. You see the attendance code is up there. I'll let you take care of that. I'll try to keep it up throughout the lecture. There are some new chapters up on top hat. Chapter 12 I have not yet posted. There's something I had to iron out about that, so I'll figure that out and get that going as soon as I can. But chapters 10 and 11 are up there. And also a new problem set, right? So, right, there it is. One homework. I actually put the second one up there, so I should update the slide here. Just a gentle reminder to do the work in the top hat section in which you are registered going forward. That doesn't really apply to this section. It's more the second, my second section, where everybody is a bunch of people signed up for the wrong section. And you can see from the due dates on the problem sets that we're kind of gunning for, I think I have November 4 as my tentative due date for everything, which would, I guess, signal to you that that's the end of our end of this cycle where we'll do the usual exam, practice, all that stuff. And so hopefully we know how all that works. So pursuant to that, I did over the weekend, hopefully got all of your grades into Blackboard, right? Nice grade book there. And I also combined the two parts of the exam together to give you a single combined exam score, which I then curved, right? And so, in fact, maybe I should just take a minute and tell you how the curve worked here. Let me see if I can do this. My technique is to create a kind of rolling curve. So what I did is, if your exam score was X, right, I made the curve X plus 100 minus X over 3, right? So what does this do? It effectively, this is the number of points you lost on the exam, 100 minus X. So if you got a 70, this would be a 30, this thing in the numerator here. And then I divide that by 3. So really what it amounts to is, for each point you lost, you get 3 points. Or for each 3 points you lost, you get a point back. And it was kind of how I worked the curve. So you can have a look at that and see what your curved score was and all that stuff. And of course, you can still make complaints about or you can make comments, I'll say, and corrections about the grading of the exam. There's no statute of limitations on that. I just took a little while because I was trying to get most of those done before I did anything with exams and curves and all that. Yes?
Besides office hours, is there a library that we can go to for extra help?
Oh, for extra help. Yes, there is actually. I posted it on Blackboard. I sent out a message about tutoring, right? Our tutoring center is in full swing, so if you need extra help, that's a great place to go. That's actually, the center is manned by our master's students, and they're a pretty impressive group. It's helpful not only for you, but for them to sort of get practice explaining things, so I encourage you to go get help if you need it. I'm just going to move this a little bit. All right. Hopefully that's all right. Okay. Anything else? I think that's about it. Okay. So, diving in, right? Last time we talked a little bit about what I've been calling competitive firms. What I should say is firms operating in a competitive industry, right? Now, one of the practical reasons we start here is because what we do when we talk about these competitive firms is that they only make really one decision, or maybe two related decisions if you want to think about it that way. Right? We assume that our market is such that there's really only a quantity decision, right? How much do I produce if I'm a firm? We assumed away all the other stuff, right? All the stuff here, I think I have a list here, or I have a list later in the slide deck, mainly because we're going to build off of this, right? We're going to say, okay, now what happens is, once we understand what's going on here, what happens when we allow additional complications to enter into the picture? So we said that each firm is producing the same good, right? Same exact product, oil, wheat, whatever, right? And the reason why we did this is because we don't want to have to worry about these more complicated decisions, like finding a niche for your product, or thinking about the quality of your product, or even advertising, right? Oil is oil. Even that's not true, but it's a simplification to get us going. And that's the only decision we're worried about, is how much of it to produce, right? Oil or whatever the product is. Of course, I'll say, I know that's probably disappointing to hear for a lot of you, so I'll say it again. We start here because we can then start adding in the things that we think are interesting as we like, right? And today, hopefully at the end of the class, we'll start thinking about what happens when your product becomes a little bit different than everybody else's, right? Or maybe a lot different. Right? That is to say, you start having an exclusive product, and we'll see that this is one way of introducing this concept of market power. Right? What happens when you have some control over your market, right? But I'm getting way ahead of myself. All we want to do here is think about this competitive industry. Yes, question? The attendance code? Oh, I'm sorry. I'll put it back. I guess I can put it back up here. I was ready for a deep question about economic theory and attendance code. Right. Okay, and so we boiled this down to really two related decisions, which involve production, right? Firms decide how much to produce and whether or not to produce, and that's really it, right? No advertising, quality, R&D, none of that stuff for now. So some other assumptions, right, to ensure, right, these things, if you look at my last bullet point here, these collective assumptions ensure that firms are price takers, meaning that our model gets even simpler, right? If we assume that firms are very small relative to the market, firms are producing the same thing, and there's this firms can enter and exit the market. I mean, maybe you think about that third arrow point as leading to this first point, right? The fact that firms can come and go as they please means that each firm is small relative to the market. Well, collectively, these assumptions mean that firms just take the market price as given. And so notice what this does to our firm decision problem. It makes it really as simple as it possibly can be and still be interesting, right? Each firm observes a market price, looks at its costs, right? And then makes a decision about how much to produce. And today we'll discuss this decision about whether or not to produce at all, right? So that's about as simple as a mechanical, description of an industry as you could get. And hopefully we'll be able to think about how this industry operates, how we're supposed to, what sort of attitude we might take towards this industry as society, all of these things, right? Once again, it's our benchmark, it's our test case that gets us into all those things I know you really want to talk about. Market power, advertising, strategy, and all that stuff. Okay, so this competitive firm, the firm operating in one of these industries, well, it has its cost structure, right? We talked about that pretty extensively last time, which we boiled down to these two cost curves. Marginal cost curves, right? The cost of producing an additional unit given some level of production, and average costs, which were just the cost per unit. Right? This sums up basically the entire technological situation of the firm for us. And we will see that once we know these two things, or once we've characterized them, we can just kind of think about those decisions I was talking about on the previous slide in as simple a fashion as possible. Right? How did it look, or what did it look like? You'll remember here was my table. This was my simplest possible table. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right, were the possible units of output. This was my oil rig, I believe. We had the total costs there. Remember that there was that 2-unit cost. Even though we don't produce anything, that was a fixed cost, right? The cost of just setting up a rig. Whether or not we actually run it, we still have to pay for it, right? And then we saw how these costs went up, and in particular how my marginal costs were increasing, right? Each successive unit was more costly than the one before it to produce, right? And once again, you can kind of stare at this table and remind yourself to keep per unit things and totals separate, right? And so the total cost, by the way, basically creates these two things, right? You can compute average costs from total costs by just dividing total costs by output, right? You can compute marginal costs by just taking the change in total costs as we go from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, right? So that cost structure is essentially everything we have to say about the technological situation of the firm, right? How it goes about producing and what the implications of, market stuff like wages and rental for land and costs of raw materials, all of that. Okay. So if we wanted to get a visual description of this, it looked a little bit like that, right? We have our average cost curve kind of being U-shaped, a marginal cost curve kind of increasing. Now oftentimes, when you go on and take Eco 200 or 300, you'll see more complex marginal cost curves. Some people draw them so they go down and then up, right? That's fine, but usually the important thing is that marginal costs eventually go up, right, after you hit a certain level. And almost always, I just said usually and then didn't finish my thought, almost always, all the interesting decisions occur where marginal cost is going up, right? So we can just think of it like this. You can just have this in your mind's eye as a picture of the firm, right? Of course, I'll remind you about a couple of details. Average cost is U-shaped, right? And you can marginal costs are increasing, at least over the important range here. And this, in turn, I guess, drives why average cost is U-shaped, right? If you'll remember, it's sort of this, we're spreading fixed costs over more units, but at the same time, marginal cost is going up. Average cost is kind of a race between those two things. And we had this interesting sort of geometric fact that average cost should be increasing when marginal cost is greater than average cost. I've called that the cat effect, right, after Carl Anthony Towns, if you remember our thought experiment with average heights in the classroom. Average cost should be decreasing when marginal cost is less than average cost. I've called that the DeVito effect, right, the Danny DeVito effect, once again with average heights. And then, of course, if you put all of this together, for those two things to make sense, average cost has to cross marginal cost at its minimum, right? And so that's my picture here is, it's one of these blockiness of units things. If I had truly smooth curves, right, that would work out exactly. But we're pretty close, right? Okay. Moving on. So decision making, how do firms make decisions? If you remember, I had a great spreadsheet that I showed you last time with prices and revenues and all that stuff on there. The great thing about that discussion was that in the end it boiled down to a very simple rule for figuring out how a firm should maximize profits, right? We said what firms can do is just produce up until that point where price and marginal costs are equal, right? Intuitively, when price is greater than marginal cost, well, if you produce that unit, you get more back than you give up, right? Price is something like your additional revenue from another unit, your marginal revenue. I'll sneak that in there and we'll push that idea a little bit further. And your marginal cost is what it costs. So if your unit adds more to revenue than it does to cost, you should go ahead and produce it. Of course, if the opposite is true, you shouldn't produce it. The result is that as you sort of, produce and see how price and marginal costs look, and you sort of adjust your decisions to that, in the end, when price is equal to marginal cost, that's about where you really can't do any more adjusting. So that's a nice way of a firm maximizing profits. Okay. Great. So that was our key to day-to-day operations, right? How much oil do I want to produce at any given time? Well, what is the price? What are my marginal costs? My next example will be maple syrup. It's kind of our first real fall day of the year, so it's a good subject. How much do I produce? Well, I want to get the marginal costs of my production equal to about the price. We're going to add to this new idea that what firms can then do, once you've sort of gotten price, once you've sort of picked out the best possible amount of output to produce, well, we can then see how well you're doing with that decision by comparing P and AC, right? Price and average costs, price and cost per unit, right? That's almost a more familiar accounting concept, maybe the easier one to understand. It's just your profit margin, right? What is your price? What is your cost per unit? You look at those two things and that tells you your profits per unit, right? We can then, from our simple diagram, compute profits for the firm, and we'll see it's just another exercise in geometry. And then we can go from there and think about how good our decisions are. And it turns out that this profit, right, whether or not there's profit there, that will be our engine for driving industry behavior over time, right? And that might be a familiar story to you. You sort of think about a lot of industries like that anyways, right? Well, what industry do you want to jump into? You want to get into one where there's profits, right? That's kind of where profits are the thing that pull resources around in the economy. So it looks a little bit like this, right? This is our comprehensive picture of a firm operating in a competitive market, right? So think about how great that is. All these assumptions we made, all these things we talk about, it boils down to this simple picture, and you can look at this and see just about everything. Well, we're going to add something to this in a second. But this really tells us everything that we want to know about the firm. So you see the geometry of marginal costs and average costs. The firm here is producing where Q star is optimal production here, is producing where price and marginal costs are equal, right? That's the profit maximizing rule. Well, now you'll notice what we can do is we can take this output and we can go down to the average cost curve, right? And that will give, at this Q star, that'll give for us the profit maximizing, the profits at the profit maximizing output, right? The profit margin, I should say, right? Because P is just where my dashed line is. AC is here off the curve, so if I look at that difference, I get that thing called the profit margin. Well, you might have known from previous work in this class that we can parlay that geometry into a bit more, and we can say, well, if this distance is the profit margin, and this distance is output, if we multiply profit per unit, right, times the number of units, we get total profits, right? So this yellow shaded area here tells me how much profit the firm is making, right? You can see it right there. And of course, if you're a firm, the bigger the rectangle, the better, right? That's the basic idea. And so what we can do is we can then sort of look at the size of this rectangle and sort of see whether or not the firm, we can also see if it exists, right? Sometimes there isn't a rectangle. We saw that for some prices last time, it could be the case that I'm making a loss. I guess it bears mentioning that even in those cases, we can still use the marginal cost rule, right? Price equal marginal cost. We'll just be minimizing losses. Okay. All right, so you can think about, just a couple of things that I'd also like to point out about this. We talked about how marginal cost and supply are basically the same thing. We got a little derivation of that last time. You can think about that as being true for the market and for the firm in general, and this will allow us to kind of put these two things together in one, I guess, kind of a tandem picture, right? That'll allow us to see how an industry works. One other thing I'm going to add to this is this idea that these profits, right, coupled with this idea that firms are small and can come and go as they please, gives us a way of understanding how the industry operates over a long period of time, right? So we'll imagine that entry occurs when there are profits to be made, and exit occurs when there are losses being made, right? So I'm in the oil industry, I'm producing along happily there. I'm making a pretty good profit. Somebody else sees this, and they say, wow, Baker's killing it in the oil industry. I'm going to enter, I'm going to get my own rig going, right? Someone else could say, well, I could say, well, I'm slaving away in the maple syrup industry, as the case may be, right? But I'm not making any money. My profit rectangle is non-existent, so I could leave the industry, right? And that's typically how things work, right? People come and go into industries as profits are to be made or losses are to be made. New York City provides a lot of, you just sort of walk around on the streets and you observe a lot of entry and exit from industries. And I'm always kind of amazed by this. So the vape shop thing, I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's amazing how much entry there has been into that industry. And it kind of surprises me that there's so much profit to be made there. Right. Anyway, so one other thing we're going to do is we can now, when you're talking about dynamics, right? I keep saying we're going to talk about industry dynamics. What you really mean is how something behaves over time, right? That's what dynamics is. And so we need to be, when we're talking about time, we need to kind of think about the time interval we're talking about. And it turns out we're just going to have this portable definition, right? We'll think about time as being roughly chopped into 2 period lengths. In the long run, we'll suppose that's a period of time long enough for someone to enter an industry, right? Get up and running. How long does it take for you to set up an oil rig or a maple syrup operation or a vape shop, right? A couple months, a couple years. It depends on the setting, right? So I have down here, oil production. It might take a couple years to build a rig and get going, right? Steel, right? If you're talking about refining steel, building a whole plant, definitely a couple years, maybe even a decade. Maple syrup, maybe the long run in that case, the time it takes for you to get into the industry is just a month or so, right? You go down to Home Depot, you buy a couple, once again, I don't know what I'm talking about here. You buy a couple steel buckets and you set up a stove and all that stuff and you're good to go, right? A couple months. So we have this nice, and of course we don't mind this because it means that the tools that we develop, we can kind of move around to think about all these different situations, right? Okay. And of course the short run, I keep saying it, the price equal marginal cost stuff, you might think about that as the day-to-day operation, or the period's short enough in which you can just change the price of something, basic, or not the price, the amount you're producing, right? Oil well, maybe you can just run, there's a dial you turn, so it's almost instant, right? How you can adjust that. Okay. Well, we can then think about everything as kind of shaken down like this, right? So now we have what we usually understand as a market on the left here, right? Demand and supply intersecting. Of course, supply we know builds in marginal costs across the industry, right? Well, they intersect and they determine this market price. In my example, it's 8, right? And of course, all the individual firms in the industry make the market supply, but look at my numbers here. Here I have thousands of cans of maple syrup. Here's my maple syrup on this lovely fall day industry. Thousands of cans per day, right, in this maple syrup market, price of 8. Over here we have the individual maple syrup firm, Dave's Maple Syrup, right, making 10 cans per day, right? So here's this assumption that the firm is really small relative to the market, right? And what does that get us here? Well, it means that this firm cannot influence price. I've cleverly labeled price here marginal revenue, right, to reflect what it means for the firm's decision-making process, right? That each unit that is produced and sold returns $8 in revenue. Each additional unit, I should say, produces $8 in revenue for the firm. Okay, so you can see what's going on here. The giant market forces of demand and supply determine the price. The firm then takes the price as just some given, right? And does the usual price equal marginal cost thing, maximizes profits here at this amount. It turns out to be 10, right? And of course we have this blue rectangle, right? And that would be the profit rectangle here. Here I've labeled it economic profit. And I don't know if I've said this before, but let's see here. All right, okay, so let me I'll try to keep up with my slides here. We might think about the previous picture here as a short-run equilibrium in good times, right? Why short run? Well, because we haven't said anything about changing the number of firms or anything like that, but we might wonder if there's going to be some entry or exit which would change the number of firms, right? Think back to the early days of class where we said there were a bunch of things that fixed a supply curve in position: cost of inputs, technology, the number of firms. Remember that one? Right. So all those things are fixed in the background. And so in the short run, we would think about this as a complete description of what the firm is experiencing in an industry and what the industry looks like. That's why I've called it short run. Intuitively, when we start thinking about the long run, firms coming in and out of the industry, entry and exit, that's going to change the position of the supply curve. Okay. So one thing I just want to say here is when we're talking about economic profit, we usually think about, we have to be very careful about including everything that we're using as resources and what payments they're getting. So we all know that profit usually means revenue exceeds costs, but I want to just focus your attention on costs. Right? We talked a lot about opportunity costs. You have to include those as well, right, when you're thinking about costs. So, you can talk about this, for extensively about this. I'm going to try not to. But really the key thing is that, especially when we're going to talk about situations where profits are dissipated by entry, and when you start saying things like, well, there's zero profits, students start thinking, well, poor Dave, he's slaving away in the maple syrup industry, and at the end of the day, he pays for his bottling and all that stuff. There's nothing left in the cash register. That's not exactly true, right? If Dave's putting his time in, Dave has to be compensated as well, right? And so whatever's left in the cash register, that's Dave's payment for working in the maple syrup industry, and that should be about equal to what Dave could be doing elsewhere, right? He should be getting, put another way, a fair wage for his own labor. So everything is getting compensated fairly in some sense when there's zero economic profit. So, right, capital, in the end, costs, all of these things are costs. Tree maintenance, and can tell I worked really hard at thinking about how the maple syrup industry works here. That's worth just sort of noting. So anyway, let's think about what this looks like. Here we have the industry in short-run equilibrium, right? I've called it a good times equilibrium. It is for the firms because the typical firm here, Dave's Syrup, is making a profit. In fact, you can even figure out what the profit is, right? It would be $290 times 10. Is that $29 a day there? I just did that by 8 minus 510 times 10, right? So you get you'll have some practice fiddling around with these numbers on the problems, the homework problems. Okay, so what do we expect to have happen over time? Well, here's the picture for posterity's sake. What I'm going to do is maybe I'll just draw it up. This is one of those situations where there's a lot of moving parts, so maybe it's best if you just sort of see me do it on the overhead here. Let me cut to that. Let's see. There we go. So you get a feel for how things work. And then, I'll see if hopefully I can draw curves that make some sense here. Let's see. That's pretty good. Okay. So it's not too bad. I'll draw there the industry. And here's the firm, so we'll call this the industry. This is the firm. I'll use this little q, P. P is the same, and this is big Q. And so I'll draw marginal cost. Try to get this so it looks about right. That's not bad. Average costs like that. There's my picture of the firm, a little fuzzy. Right? And then maybe I'll try to reproduce what I had on the previous slide here. Let me see if I can find a... It's just nice to have a red marker too, but I'm not finding one. Okay. Soldier on here. So, and then maybe we have market demand and supply like this. Right, so this determines this quantity in the market, and more importantly for our purposes here, the price. And then what we would do is we would kind of take this price line across, and we would see here that our firm, following the usual rule, price equals marginal cost, comes down here, and that gives us Q star. And why would we call this market equilibrium in good times? Well, we go down here, this is our profit margin, go across like that, those are our profits, right? Dave's maple syrup profits. Okay, so that's in the short run. We see what each firm is doing, we see what the market looks like. Now, the little wrinkle that we've added is that in the short run, particularly if firms are free to enter and exit the industry, what should happen is someone should say, "Oh, well, Dave has a nice operation." Maybe Dave's my neighbor. I look at Dave. I say, "Dave's making some good money doing that maple syrup thing, right? Maybe I should jump into the industry as well." And so I go down to Home Depot and buy all the equipment. A couple of months elapses, or maybe a season. Next season, I'm ready to go. I'm not the only one. There's a couple more of us all over the place, right? We've all observed this. We jump into the maple syrup industry. Well, what then happens? One would expect that over time, this entry would shift supply out, right? Remember, that's one of the things that we held fixed behind the scenes with supply. So when there's entry, it shifts supply out. And you can see what the impact is on each of us as we're making our maple syrup production. Well, the price now goes from P to P1, right? It was there, now it's here. And this causes us to reduce our output a little bit. Right, maybe it's no longer worth it for Dave to use that tree that's at the edge of his property. Right, he has to drive all the way out there, so he says, "I'll pull back a little bit and just use the ones closer." He decreases his output a little bit, and you can kind of see what happens. The lower price. Now we can recompute the rectangle, and we see that this is cut in because of this price falling. This is cut into Dave's or everybody in the maple syrup industry. It's cut into their profits a little bit. Right? But there's still profit to be made here, and we would expect that would result in even further entry, right? So what should happen is maybe over the next couple of years or whatever, couple months, there's even more entry, right? And now I've drawn things such that, well, let's see. We have P2, and we wind up maybe at this price here. So now what's happening? Well, price has fallen so much so that it's pretty close to this point where marginal cost and average cost are equal, right? What is the significance of this? Well, first of all, note that there will be such a point under our geometric assumptions, right? There's always going to be a point where that's true because of the geometry of marginal costs and average costs, right? Average costs being cut by marginal cost at its minimum. That is this point here, right? So you can see what happens here. If you try to draw a profit rectangle, there isn't one, right? The rectangle's gone because P equal MC at that point here. So essentially what's happening is Dave, me, everybody else in the maple syrup industry, we're all maximizing profits. But when we maximize profits, we're just breaking even, right? And think about what that means here. It means that at the end of the day, I clean out the cash register, I pay for all the stuff that I'm using in my industry, and then there's enough money left over for me, and I look at it and I say, well, I'm making about what I would make at any other job in the economy, right? I'm making a fair wage myself at the end of the day. Do I want to leave the maple syrup industry? Well, there's no reason to. Right? If I'm not in the maple industry, do I want to enter? Well, it's 6 of what is it? 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I don't know if that's the right expression. Right. And so you can see, though, that in the end we have this P equal MC equal AC. Right? Okay, let's, I think what I'm going to do is, I kind of had this as my time permitting slide here, and maybe, we'll work it in reverse, or we'll work another situation in reverse about how economists might understand all of this working, or how it describes dynamics in response to an industry change. So let's just redraw this picture, and what I'm going to try to do is draw an industry that's in equilibrium. Right, both short run and long run, meaning that in the short run, we have firms making their best short run decisions, price equal marginal cost, but also average cost equal marginal cost equal price, right, at the same time. So that would be kind of a long run equilibrium as we just sort of described. So I'll draw let's see, here's my little q, p, p. I'll draw marginal cost. I'll draw an average cost curve here, like that. Nicely done, right? And then we'll note that this point here, I'll go over to this diagram. We have demand and supply like that, right? And this would be a picture of a industry, a competitive industry anyways. Sorry, I forgot to turn off the overhead projector there. This would be a competitive industry in a long-run equilibrium. There, right? Okay. Now we might imagine what happens when there's some sort of change in this industry. So let's suppose maybe we're talking about vape shops. Of course, vape shop output, whatever it is not exactly something that fits our competitive market, right? Our paradigm, like oil or wheat or maple syrup even. But that doesn't mean we can't sort of use the model, maybe just noting that it's a little bit different, to think about it, right? We observe there are a lot of small vape shops out there, but maybe a big vape industry, and so we might ask, how does this industry respond to certain things over time? Let's consider maybe there's some new report that comes out that says, vaping's bad for your health or something, right? And what this might do is it should shift back the demand for vape shop products, right? If that's what we want to think about as Q here. Well, you can see what happens then on my diagram. The price falls from this, let me just flesh it out a little bit here. The price falls from this P to this P1. And now we have our firms in short-run equilibrium. Well, they're doing what they usually do. They're setting price equal marginal cost, right? But you can see here that what we have, output that each firm sells falls a little bit. But now what we have is average cost up here and price down here. Here we have a loss, right? Firms are making a loss equal to this rectangle. What do we expect this to do? Firms would say, well, now that there's been this change in the way the market works, I'm going to get out of the market, right? How do I get out of the market? Well, you've actually maybe have observed this. In my neighborhood, there was a restaurant that was there for a long time, and then, one day it closed, and, I asked a neighbor, well, what happened? Well, their lease ran out, and they just decided to shut down shop. They weren't making enough money, right? That might be how you exit a market. You just say, well, okay, over time, today I'm going to do the best I can. I'll minimize my losses by producing a little bit. But when my lease is up, I'm out, right? That would be the long-run equivalent here. I'm not going to get back in this industry. In micro, in 200 or even 300, you make a big deal about, or you can sort of dig into the nuances of these situations where you're making a loss, right? So you can talk about situations where you should just shut down immediately, right? You can develop a shutdown point, or you can say, when should I produce in the short run, even though I'm losing money? So you can look at those sorts of decisions. We're just gonna, we're gonna keep moving and move past that. So, right, demand shifts back, firms exit, right, over time. And what would we expect that to do? Well, once again, the number of firms is changing, right? The number of firms is changing. What does that do? Well, that means that over time, right, we might expect that the supply shifts back. And so, of course, when will firms stop leaving the industry? Well, once price goes back up to this point here, right? This price equal average cost equal marginal cost point. So that's kind of the exit dynamics in an industry. So hopefully you see how that works. I have some problems in the problem set that give you a little bit of practice with this. But this is kind of how we think about entry and exit and all of that working. Pretty simple, right? And of course, going forward, we're going to think about some of the more intricate entry, exit, product development, all those sorts of decisions. Now that we have these, or once we get all of this under our belts here. So, there it is. That was my example of oversaturation of the market. Really, the oversaturation in my example emerged because demand changed, right? Demand shifted back, and that triggered over time, right, the exit of firms out of the market. Okay. And I think I said everything there, so I'll just let you look at that for a second as I go to my next slide. And for those who just are coming to class, got the attendance back up there. Okay, well maybe at the end of the day, here's what we really want to know, right? We now have a pretty good mechanical understanding as to how this competitive market works, right? How we expect it to behave, what we expect prices to look like. Notice, by the way, we have this interesting result that, reading between the lines a little bit, that in the long run, over time, price should be about equal to average cost, right? That is one thing that kind of happens in our market over time. As profits are eliminated, we wind up with price and average cost being roughly the same here. So, in the short run, of course, we have price equal marginal cost. But if we bring back our consumers into this story, you'll remember that marginal benefits, right? Consumers consume up to the point where marginal benefits equal price, right? We haven't said much about that. It's been all about firms. Let me bring that back in there. So you could see here we could kind of string all this together and say that price equal marginal cost equal price equal marginal benefits. Put another way, marginal benefits are greater than marginal cost for all units produced, and all such units are produced, right? So the marginal costs of producing the very last unit in our competitive market are equal to about the marginal benefits produced. This is kind of like our old consumer surplus, producer surplus being maximized argument, right? When demand and supply cross, that is to say, if we think about one curve capturing marginal costs and the other capturing marginal benefits, we exhaust all the gains from exchange. It might be one way to think about it. So that's still true, right? We still have demand and supply crossing, as we did in our previous analysis. But now we have this other little fact, right? That firms are sort of driven to produce. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
If marginal benefit and marginal cost are equal, would that be worth it at all for the person who has the market?
The very last one. So the question is, if marginal cost and marginal benefits are equal, is it worth it? Well, remember that marginal benefits and marginal costs, just because the last unit is equal, right? All the previous units have a different characteristic. For all the previous units, right, marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs, right? One way of seeing this, maybe I should remind you of this, that's a timely question, I would say. One way of seeing this is when you look at your typical demand curve. Right, we draw it out. So here's demand, here's supply, right? What we're kind of saying is that supply reflects marginal costs, demand reflects marginal benefits. For the very last unit, they are equal, right? But look at all the units prior to this. For this unit, say, I'll call it Q prime, marginal benefits are here and marginal costs are here, right? So all of these units, you can even think about it that way. Every time a unit is produced at a cost here and exchanged, creating benefits up here, society wins, right? And that was kind of the consumer surplus, producer surplus stuff we talked about before. But now we have this additional observation, right? That firms are in effect forced to produce at this point where marginal cost and average cost are equal, right? That is to say, they're forced to produce at this point where maximizing profits breaks even, right? That's effectively what happens. Firms are producing at this break-even point in these long-run equilibria. Now, once again, a consequence of the geometry of marginal cost and average cost is this is at the minimum of average cost, right? So if you want to look at this picture, you can look at this one. Yeah, this one's pretty good. Maybe even this one. Right? What we're saying is that firms if you sort of imagine the industry picture being here, as entry occurs, right, because of this profits here, as firms enter, each firm in the industry is forced to produce at this point here, right? There's no profit rectangle, that's zero profit, there's no more entry or exit. But it has this other interesting property that's the minimum of average cost, right? That is the minimum of cost per unit. Well, if you want to think about it this way, this is an added bonus for society, in that if you're producing something at the minimum cost per unit, you're producing it as efficiently as you possibly can, right? So that's what happens in this long-run equilibrium. Firms are forced to produce at the point where they're most efficient, right? So maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you think again about this picture, this is great. The firm is making profits. It's producing a lot at the price line there, right? But you might think about it as, from the perspective of society, this individual firm is producing too much, right? What would be better from the perspective of society is if there were more firms and each one was producing a little bit less. That would lower the cost per unit for society, right, from producing this good. So this competitive market, I guess the punchline is, this competitive market gives us a really nice set of results as far as efficiency goes, right? We wind up with all of the stuff we developed before, the consumer and producer surplus, right? Maybe by way of market interference, we talked about how that was how the competitive market generated the most efficient result. And then we can add in this average cost story. Firms have to be as efficient as possible to survive in this competitive industry. So we wind up with, producing things as cheaply as possible and producing all those units that can be produced that generate more benefits than they cost. It's quite a good story for the competitive market, right? And so typically we even think about it this way. We think about this as the benchmark, right? We say, okay, well, what is the best case scenario? It doesn't get much better than a competitive market. So we can basically think about all of these results and then say, if we introduce a bell or a whistle, right, how does that change things? And how does the result deviate from the competitive outcome? Right? That's kind of if you want to think about it this way, this is our counterfactual for analyzing different market structures. I should have put that on the slide. I said that nicely after I kind of went around in circles for a couple minutes. Okay. Now, one thing I'll throw in there is that in a couple weeks, when we start talking about things like environmental economics, we will see that these results sometimes might not hold, right? That is to say, there are some situations in which we expect a competitive industry does not do what's best for society. It's interesting to think about those cases as well. Okay. So that's a great story if you're an economist, right? You're saying, ooh, competition is good, right? Competitive market, great results from the perspective of society, right? The age-old question once again. Everybody working in pursuit of their own self-interest, is it good for the whole? Well, here we would say yes. All of these businesses out there are only, Dave is only worried about himself and how his maple syrup is doing, his maple syrup business, right? He's making day-to-day production decisions to maximize his profits. He's entering and exiting the industry to maximize his profits. That's all he cares about. Yet, in the end, we wound up with this result that everybody doing that produced this nice set of results from the perspective of society, right? Pursuit of individual self-interest, good for society, right? Okay, that's a great story, but remember we had to make several perhaps heroic assumptions along the way, right? Just to get everything to kind of work analytically here. So the way we set up this model, things were very simple. Make sure I still have the attendance code there. We set it up, in fact, so that we would get things to be very simple from the perspective of the firm. We made okay, firms just decide output. They don't have to decide about advertising, product quality, product positioning. They don't do any consumer research, or they don't do any innovation, R&D, none of that stuff, right? We assumed it all away. We assume that firms all produce the same thing. A homogeneous product, right? Homogeneous product. Homogeneous, which one is it? I think my second class made me self-conscious, right, and said I was pronouncing it wrong. And then I looked in the dictionary. Either way is okay, I think, right? Firms produce the same product, right? We made that assumption. That's not true generally either, right? And we also assume that firms were small relative to the market, right? This is kind of this idea that no firm can influence price, firms can enter and exit freely. It kind of those two kind of go together. We might then ask, well, what if these things are not true, right? And indeed, this is kind of the way we've set up our logical experiment. We've looked at this competitive case because it's simple and we completely understand the dynamics, right? How it works in the short and long run. Now what we can do is we can start to think about what happens when we relax these decisions. What if advertising is important? What if firms produce different products? Right? All of these things. And so this is where it really gets exciting. Right? So once I've gotten to this point in class, I start getting excited because what comes next is, I think, a really neat set of interesting things. What happens? Really, the impact of relaxing almost any one of these assumptions, advertising and stuff, in research and development, that'll have its own set of tools we'll develop, game theory, strategic behavior, all of that stuff. But if you think about what happens when firms, get a little bit larger relative to the market, firms don't produce a homogeneous product. Right? They don't produce the same product. Ultimately, what this means is that firms get some degree of market power, right? What does that mean? Well, I'm going to show you what it means, really. It means that firms perceive they have a demand curve for their product that slopes up and down, right? They don't just have this flat price line that they sort of look at to make decisions. They have to sort of think about pricing decisions, right? That's really the big thing that happens when we think about market power. And you don't have to get very far to imagine, situations where this occurs. So maybe we're talking about the market for coffee. You can even look around the Upper East Side here. You look at, even Hunter College. There's all these different places that make coffee. They're all a little different, right? There's a Starbucks. There's the World Cup. There's the cafeteria coffee, right? They all produce coffee, but each one has a different, the coffee's a little bit different. They're in different locations, right? They sell different stuff along with their coffee. So in some sense, each one is its own little market, right? And indeed, when you think about these things, am I going to go to World Cup or Starbucks? You might even think, well, what is the price at one of these places vis-a-vis the other things, those other things? So suddenly you start to compare prices and make prices based on the fact that these aren't exactly the same things, but there may be substitute products, right? Very close substitutes, not exactly the same. So that's what we mean. And of course, the people in charge of these businesses know that. They know that they have some market power now. What do they do? Okay. Well, there's a couple of ways to think about this, and one of the ways that we're going to push forward here, or one of the things that we're going to think about, is that everybody has some degree of exclusivity, and you should be able to convince yourself that an alternative way of thinking about this is that it's hard for someone to enter your exact industry, right? That is to say, no one can jump in and produce exactly what World Cup Coffee is producing, right? They have an exclusive location and their own product, right? And indeed their own employees and their own things that they make along with the coffee. It's almost impossible for someone to produce exactly that good, right? And what we're going to think about is this constituting a particular form of a barrier to entry, right? That means that there isn't this freedom of entry and exit. So we're going to have to think about that. But for now, right, that'll lead to the general theory of monopoly. For now, however, what we're going to do is think about what happens when a firm has market power and just that. So once again, we're leaving aside advertising and product placement and all those things. What just happens when you get market power? How does that change how you behave? Right? When you get control over, a little, maybe a small demand curve, but a demand curve nonetheless. Right? You have your unique product. Really what happens is price and quantity become related, I shouldn't say. Related's not the best word, but now you have to worry about both price and quantity when you make decisions. So here's a really simple example. We'll imagine that maybe my kids are starting to get old enough to go to college, so I need some extra money for college, and I realize, well, I'm pretty free on Saturday mornings. I could give economics lessons, right? I have 3 free hours, so you can think about this as Baker's economics lesson production firm. Weekly lessons I give, on Saturday. I have a very simple cost structure. Right now we're not so worried about cost, we're worried about price and demand, so we'll make it as simple as possible, right? A specific theme of economics. Start with the simplest possible case and understand that, right? So each lesson costs me $50 I can do 3 lessons a week. Each one costs me about $50 to do. What does that mean? Well, maybe I've determined that I could do something else and, deliver packages or, maybe tutoring or something or whatever. But I could make $50 an hour opportunity cost of my time maybe, right? So there's my cost. 1 lesson cost me $50, and that's true for each lesson. So I just pointed this out because I'm even getting rid of the increasing marginal cost assumption, right? Typically, you'd want marginal costs to be going up. And you can imagine reasons why that might happen here, right? My marginal costs, after 1 hour of lessons, I'm getting tired, right? Things like that. But we'll just suppose they're flat, right? And so the total cost of giving 3 lessons to think about is just 50 plus 50 plus 50, and AC equals MC equals 50. Okay, but I know that there's a demand structure for my economics lessons, my 3 lessons that I might offer. I might know from fiddling around or whatever that if I offer lessons at $100, I'll get 1 taker. If I offer lessons at $80, I'll get a second customer, 2 takers. And if I offer lessons at $60, then I'll fill up all 3 of my hours that I have available, right? 3 lessons. I might just know that, right? And of course, I know that this is the case. Contrast this with the case, I'll do this in a second, where I have this unique good. I'm in my building. I have a unique personality, a unique approach to economics. I have an educational background, whatever. Other people might be doing economics lessons, but I understand that mine are unique in some way. So this might be different if we said an economics lesson is an economics lesson, right? In that case, there might just be some going market rate. But here I perceive that, maybe I do that thing where on the building bulletin board, I put a poster up there with the, tear a tab if phone number thing. I put it on a telephone pole, who knows, something like that, right? I post my price, call if interested. Okay, well first let's just think about this case where if there is a going price of $60, right, that is to say there is just this thing called an economics lesson, there's a giant market out there, and I observe that the going rate for lessons is $60. Well, that would mean certain things for my decision, right, how I would make my decision, and in particular what I've been telling you, maybe you can sort of read between the lines here and think about this as the competitive situation. What I've been saying is, what I do is just look at this price and compare it to my marginal cost, right? That's the going price. P is equal to 60. Well, my first lesson, P is greater than MC. 60 is greater than 50, I'll do it. My second lesson, P is greater than MC. My third lesson, P is greater than MC. And in my example, I have to stop there. I don't have any more time. So I'll just supply all 3 lessons at the going market price, right? But what if we sort of flip a switch and say, well, now economics lessons are not just economics lessons. Baker has a unique product, and he has that demand schedule that I talked about before. I do the telephone pole bulletin board in my building. By the way, it's an important point that my price is known to everybody. I'll throw that out there. There's a little Easter egg, and we'll come back and think about what if it isn't, right? Yet another assumption that I want to relax as we move forward. Anyway, we can mechanically just work through this, and I can say, well, let's see. If I put the price of $100, if I set the price there, we see that my one lesson, what do I earn? Well, the lesson, I'll get one lesson. I know that's my demand, right? When the price is 100, I get one taker. So if I set the price there, I'll make 100 minus 50. That's the cost. That's what I get. I'll get $50 in profits. Okay. I know that if I lower the price to 80, right? Well, I know I'll sell 2 lessons then, right? I'll make 160, but then I have 2 lessons I'm providing. Each costs 50, so my total costs are 100. We see that my revenue here is 60. Or my profits are 60, I should say. My revenues are 160, my costs are 100, my profits are 60. So if I'm doing, what any rational economic actor would do, I'd look at this and I'd say, well, I should supply those first 2 lessons. 60 is greater than 50, right? I'm making profits. Look what happens when I think about this third lesson, though. I say, okay, well, I could lower the price to 60. 60 times 3 is 180. That took me a little bit too long there. And of course my costs are 150. Now you can see that if I were to lower my price and get that third lesson, right, I'm only making $30 in profits. So if I use this as a guide to what I should do, the answer is I should provide 2 lessons at a price of $80, right? That's how I maximize my profits. Look at that first bullet point and now think about that conclusion. You'll see that they're different, right? When I can control the price, I do something different than I would do when I can't. And in fact, it turns out I do less, right? I sell less of my product than I would. So the answer is different, right, when I have market power, might be the conclusion here. So it's interesting, I'm talking about the market for economics lessons, and at the same time you're getting an economics lesson, right? Maybe it's not that interesting. Okay, so, right, we wound up with this, right? But if we wanted to think about what's really going on here, we might break this up into terminology that we understand, right? That we've already talked about. And so we might do a marginal analysis of this problem. That is to say, we can compare additional revenue and additional costs. This will help us going forward. So our first lesson brings in $100 and costs 50, right? Marginal revenue of 100. Additional revenue, marginal cost of 50. MR is greater than MC, I should do it. The second one we see brings in $60 effectively in additional revenue, right? 2 lessons bring me 160, 1 lesson brings me 100, 160 minus 100 means $60 in additional revenue, right? So if I compare 60 and 50, I should provide that lesson as well. Given I'm providing 2 lessons, the third lesson, well, I have to lower the price to sell it. I sell 3 lessons at 60. You can now see the same comparison, 180 minus 160. You can see here this lesson brings me in, did I say 30 in marginal revenue on my next slide? No, that's 20, right? The difference between 180 and 160. My third lesson brings me in $20 in marginal revenue, right? But it costs me 50. So you might say, well, now we can see marginal revenue is less than cost for that last unit. And cast in this way, maybe now you can see why I'm saying we shouldn't do it, right? It kind of tells us why we shouldn't do it in a slightly different way. Yes?
As you are able to provide more lessons, wouldn't you charge more because they're taking up more of your time?
Okay. That's a great question. The question is, as I'm providing more lessons, shouldn't I charge more? I guess what I would say, because they're taking up more of my time, I would love to charge more, right? And maybe what I'll do is I'll use the question, which is a good one, to say, well, everybody always wants to do a lot at a high price, right? I would love to produce a huge amount and charge a very high price for the units, but I cannot, right? I'm constrained by my demand curve. right? As great as my economics lessons are, the demand is what it is. 100, 80, 60 is kind of what the curve looks like. So I have to conform with that. And indeed, you can see each lesson gives me more revenue, at least in this case, but at some point, I'm giving up, I'm not making back the marginal revenue that justifies my marginal cost. So there's a different way to think about this. Right? Of course, you can see here that the implication here is when I have this market power, I have to lower my price every time I want to sell more, right? I want to sell as much as I possibly can, but doing so involves lowering my price, right? Now, the other thing that happens is when I lower the price for, to sell another unit, I have to lower the price for all of my units, right? So in my example, I can't sell a unit at 100 anymore. I have to sell all of my units at 80 to get that extra unit off. So to get rid of another unit, all the prices of all of the units come down. And so you can think about it this way, right? When I go from 1 unit to 2 units, say, well, I lower the price and I get to sell an extra unit at that price, $80. That's good, right? I'm happy I'm selling another unit at $80. But now the first unit can no longer be sold at 100. That's bad, right? So in effect, its price falls from 80, so I get plus 80, but I lose minus 20 on that first unit, 100 to 80, right? So if you sort of add up the 80 minus 20, that gives me 60 in marginal revenue, which is the same answer we got from just looking at the change in total revenue, right? So one of the consequences of all this is that I understand that there's this trade-off I face whenever I lower the price, right? I'm selling everything at a lower price, not just the last unit, right? And as a consequence of this, one thing I want to do when I have market power is to keep the price high, right? I don't want to just keep selling units because that means my price gets lower and lower. So I sort of say I want to sell a lot, but the price is low. A lot of sales, low price, high price, low sales. I'm trying to find a happy medium in there, right? But that is typically the consequence, we just saw in my simple example, is that I will wind up restricting output to keep the price higher than it otherwise would be. And indeed, this is going to be the traditional problem with monopoly writ large, right? When we do the whole general analysis, you'll see that this generates a problem. Output is too low and price is too high when there's market power. Of course, I've kind of said that in such a way that there's a value judgment encoded in it, right? A normative statement. We're going to have to see why I would say it that way. So, one other thing you can do, though, is you can think about this two ways. As economists, we care about the perspective of society, right? Is market power good or bad for society? But if you're an individual producer trying to sell something, there's sort of another aspect of it here, right? How do you want to set your price? And there is kind of an interesting rule of thumb, which I'll mention as well. Suffice it to say, we can follow this marginal revenue rule, try to get marginal revenue and marginal costs about as close as possible, right? In competition, price and marginal revenue were exactly the same. Now they are no longer the same, right? And we're going to have to think about that a little bit more. So what we'll do next time is we're going to break this down and we'll start to think about how we would take this logic and transplant it to our whole supply, demand, cost apparatus. It'll be really a fun and interesting thing to do. So I will see you in 2 days, not the normal 3.